on the ground is there right now among Israelis?
Yeah, well, it's kind of quiet, fairly subdued. People go around about their normal lives. A couple of times a day, there's a siren goes off because there's a rocket threat. So people get into their shelters and so on. I was out last night at one of the only bars that are still open, and there's a fearfulness of where this can all go. But also a sort of certainty that this now is different, that Hamas has to be dealt with, and there's still it's been a week, 10 days since the October 7th attacks by Hamas, and their brutality is still very much in people's minds.
And it's just an active topic of conversation. Is that how you're picking this up, or is it
Yeah,
more just watching how
is.
people are interacting?
Yeah, no, people want to talk about it, and they're very sort of upset about it. I mean, the operative question, at the moment is, you've got the entire Israeli armed forces gathered around Gaza. So the question is, do you think they should go in and try and deal with this the way that the politicians and the military, the generals are saying that they plan to, and generally the answer is yes. What choice do we have? We have to do this. We have to take care of Hamas. There was a poll out today which said that about 65% of Israelis think that yes, we have to go in. Somewhere around 20% thought that we shouldn't. So there is some thought about that. Even on TV, you see actually a friend of mine, former journalist, was on TV, expounding a plan, saying that we could use this to get the Saudis, the UAE, Qatar, and so on, all on board, around a process for the Palestinians, agree not to go in, and really change the game and not follow the plan that Hamas and perhaps Iran has set out for us. But at the same time, he said, I admit it's kind of a pipe dream.
But I was struck by a video that's made its rounds now for quite a while. So this isn't fresh, but it stayed with me, which was a video of the Israeli health minister going into a local hospital in Israel to visit the wounded, and essentially getting shouted down and shouted out of the hospital by Israelis who were there, who accused her of being part of an administration that had fomented a war and a conflict. And it raises that obvious question of Israel is unified for now because there's a clear and present danger that has to be dealt with. But is there going to be seismic fallout from this for Netanyahu narrowly and for Israeli politics more broadly?
I would think so. I mean, that anger is very much there. It's also reflected in the same poll with 80. When they were asked, does Netanyahu have to accept his responsibility for what has happened? 80% said yes, and that includes a strong majority of the people who voted for him. So no, he's in deep trouble because of this. Politically, he's in deep trouble. His government's in deep trouble. It's the reason why they brought the opposition in to the for a war cabinet. But they're in very deep trouble. What it means afterwards is that is very hard to say right now. Both for Israeli the future of Israeli politics, which was absolutely dysfunctionally polarized before. Over the whole issue of the judicial independence and so on, the laws that Netanyahu was introducing, which were seen as anti-democratic by many people, had huge protests in the streets. So that whole discussion's been put on pause, but then laden on with all the anger over what happened and his failure on the security issue, which is always the biggest issue for Israel. So what happens later on is very hard to parse, just as it is to know what happens, after a ground invasion and how long that might take, in terms of the Palestinian question.
Yeah, when we say afterwards, Netanyahu will have to deal with reality, but afterwards, could be a long way off in the world
It
that
could be a
we're in
very
right
long
now.
way off, and it's
Yeah.
quite likely, he may not be around to see it. He may be out of office by then.
Bobby, U.S. President Joe Biden gave a major foreign policy speech on live television last night in the U.S., in which he laid out his vision for the role the U.S. has to play in a world that's really been, from a foreign policy standpoint, reordered uh, over the last few years. So, talk to me a little bit about that. What did you think of the speech? And then we can talk a little bit about the U.S.'s role in the world.
Well, it was a very important speech. Oval Office speeches are not everyday occurrences. I think this is the only second time that Biden's done it. He was trying to thread two different needles. He was sort of basically connecting what's going on in Israel and Gaza to what's been going on in Ukraine with the war there, and making the argument these are part of a whole, that these are challenges to democratic nations. These are challenges that American foreign policy, that America as a country, as a leader of the free world, has to reckon with and has to deal with. And his administration is asking for a quite substantial amount of money from Congress, something in the order of 120 million. 100 million of that will be basically divided between Ukraine and Israel, and a smaller proportion for humanitarian support, some of which will go to Gaza. But the big message for the audience was that these are not separate things, and I think it goes to some degree to this feeling, this question that's been raised, particularly by Republican politicians recently, that we can't deal with both these things. I mean, we've got to set aside Ukraine and we've got to focus on what's happening with Israel. And the president was trying to make the case that no, we've got to deal with both because they're both part of the same phenomenon that's taking place around the world. And I think there's an American audience for this, and we will know pretty soon in the polls how that has landed with that audience. There is a Western European, at least, audience for this that was actually probably requiring a little reassurance from the American president that America still has its eye on the ball. 2 balls now. And then
actually, Bobby, if we were to talk through it, it's 3 balls at least, right? Because there's also China and its possible aggressions in the South China Sea or toward Taiwan. Yeah. So Biden's really juggling 3 balls.
He is, and then there's an international audience, particularly an audience in the Arab world, which is now sort of inflamed with rage, and so that some of what he said was directed at them, but not a lot. He can't really. It's a lot to ask from one speech to be able to address all of these different constituencies. But the point that he's making is that America's role in the world is now. It was always complex. It's more complex now. We have all these different things that we need to deal with. He was sending the message that we can, that a superpower must not only be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, but walk, chew gum, and, if necessary, hum a tune. And that's an important message for the president to make. It's consistent with some of the things he has said before. Whether or not the U.S. audience is buying that, we'll learn, I suspect, in the next few hours when the polls begin to come out.
Well, it'll also be a referendum on this long arc of the U.S.'s own presence globally. If we go back to, say, World War II, yes. and the U.S. is an arsenal for democracy in World War I and World War II, and then during the Cold War as being perceived as this bulwark against authoritarianism and a warrior for democracy, all of which became progressively frayed during the Vietnam War era, and further frayed, I think, by the Iraq War and the occupation of Afghanistan. And Biden is now trying to reassert a role for the United States in the context of that legacy. And with a divided Congress at home, that, interestingly enough, Republicans who used to always be very hawkish and very pro-US as the world's sort of policeman, is now, more in favor of the U.S. sticking its head in the sand and hunkering down. And you have Democrats saying, we have a role to play as a global citizen, as a global military force, but those are very very much opposed to one another in terms of both, I think, the sentiment of many voters and the will of the Congress itself. And do you think that that is going to just undermine Biden no matter how he tries to reposition the U.S. right now?
It certainly was looking that way until until Saturday before last. The traditional American sort of shibboleth about foreign policy, which is that American politics ends at the water's line and water's edge, and that everything beyond our shores there is consensus around. That was shattered years and years ago, and has looked progressively less and less likely to come together again. There's still enormous divide between the Democrats, president on one side, and the Republicans on Ukraine. And I suspect that's part of the reason why Biden, the many reasons, but one of the reasons why Biden was trying to thread both of these needles together. But there seems to be consensus around Israel. On Israel, there seems to be no division. The Republicans are sort of occupying some of that familiar hawkish postures and positions, and perhaps that the Biden wants to take some of that energy and make that available for the argument around Ukraine as well. But
and of course, Bobby, you can't make the argument that the Israelis are the victims of arbitrary and unwanted violence and not make the same argument on behalf of Ukrainians.
That's what
I think if you want to be philosophically consistent and consistent from a policy standpoint, it does put Republicans who oppose Ukraine aid in the corner.
Yes, I mean, if the American politics, I don't need to tell you, quite often these days seems like a logic-free zone, but the logic of it is very clear, and I think what Biden's counting on is at least the American public to understand that. I grew up outside this country, particularly during the last couple of decades of the Cold War, and if you had told me then that there would be an American party, never mind the Republican Party, that where so many people would be so openly in favor of Putin, I would have laughed you out of the room. But that is where American politics is here now, and I think, as you say, Biden is trying to sort of ram home the logic of this, that if you cannot be for Israel and against Ukraine, you cannot argue for giving Israel more support at the same time saying, oh, we don't need to involve ourselves anymore in Ukraine. And that's the core of the speech yesterday.
Marc, weigh in on that a little bit yourself too, in terms of perceptions abroad of the US's role in the world, and whether or not you think Biden can shift sentiment enough to assert a US diplomatic and military presence that's maybe more robust than it's been in the past. Like Bobby, you've got robust foreign policy experience, and I'm interested to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, it's kind of a long journey, in the sense that before 2016, I think there was a lot of momentum in Europe to say, especially from the French and so on, to say, we have to, we're kind of tired of the US as a global policeman. There wasn't a huge amount of investment in NATO and so on, which, Obama, as much as Trump used to, even Clinton used to beat up the Europeans about that. But I think Ukraine in particular has been a sort of a massive cold shower for Europe in security terms, so that at least, in the government circles, there's now almost a desperation to keep the Americans, in and keep them on side and active. They're fully aware that they do not alone have the capacity to support a war in Ukraine against Russia for the next several years, which is quite possible. That's what's going to happen. And here again is just another example. That being said, on the streets in Europe, there's a lot of division that you can see. about whether to support Israel, and the U.S. is always tied in with that as the as either the hero or the Satan, so that is quite complicated. But at the government level, I think it's actually been quite clarifying since the February 22 invasion of Ukraine, and this will only underline that need for U.S. capacity, military capacity. No other country can go and put 2 carrier fleets of the kind of power and scale that the U.S. has done, off the Mediterranean coast, and just say to a country like Iran, which is bristling with missiles, don't.
The other wild card, obviously, in this particular conflict is bigotry, anti-Semitism, or anti-Muslim sentiments on both sides of the fences that have nothing to do with ration or policy and have everything to do with the culture wars and raw bigotry that is also a factor in forming this debate. Marc, let's come back to Israel again and the Israeli military. Do you think an occupation of Gaza is inevitable? And when we talk about that, are we talking about, I guess, again, we don't know because it's going to be a military operation and they're going to have to decide when they believe that their job is done. But if we say a short-term occupation versus a long-term occupation, is a short-term occupation inevitable, and is a long-term occupation still up for debate?
Yeah, I think the kind of maybe the most useful way to think about it is rather than a short-term occupation, there will be a military operation. That's what we assume is going to happen. If that happens, then there is no, there's in that time, there's no political authority. There's no governance there's a war in Gaza. There isn't governance. So I think the question for an occupation is the question of what do you do once that initial heavy phase of fighting is over, and you have to start thinking about governance, and you have to start putting something in place to administer and just to keep the water flowing, the rebuild the roads and do all that kind of stuff. At that point, Israel will have to decide: do we want to do this? Do we want to have responsibility for this? We know what will happen? We know there'll be a constant stream of body bags coming back, or do we want to find some other solution? And finding some other solution after that is going to be really, really tough. You can't really bring the Palestinian Authority in on tanks. They're unpopular enough as it is. And if you're not, then you need the help of the Arab world really to try and figure out some kind of solution for Gaza that doesn't include Hamas. And that's going to be quite difficult to obtain if you've just had a very, very bloody, incursion. So, this is really the dilemma for the Israelis. They feel they have to go in, but they have really no exit strategy.
And if I can come in on this, Tim, a second.
Well, go ahead, Bobby. Yep.
Yeah, our colleagues in business on the news side of Bloomberg have been reporting this consistently over the last several days, that the Biden administration has been, but Joe Biden himself, when he was in Israel, have been pressing the Netanyahu government to tell us what their plan is for what happens after. And they've been dismayed by the fact that there seems to be no plan for the day after. And that is something that everyone should be very anxious and concerned about. There will be, when the ground operation happens, it will be very bloody, very, very destructive. And those images obviously will be broadcast around the world. So having a clear line saying, okay, we're having to do this for these are the reasons we have to do this, but here's what we're going to do afterwards, is very, very important for as a way of communicating to the rest of the world. And the United States will want the Israelis to make that very clear, because we've now effectively got skin in the game.
Well, so Bobby, in that context, then is the fact that there is not a day after plan a sin of omission or a sin of commission?
Oh, that's a good question. Look, if they had gone in within 48 hours of the terrorist attacks, that would be one thing. You could say, look, they haven't had a time to pause. They've been dealing with this enormous trauma. But with every day that passes, and they've had more and more time, not just to digest the events of that terrible day, but also to figure out a plan. And we've got to think that the entire high command of the military plus the political, this sort of united government, the united cabinet, have been doing nothing but thinking about what happens in Gaza. So with every passing day, it seems more, what might have been a sin of omission at the start of this, with every passing day, it will look more and more like a sin of commission, especially since the world has been asking for such a plan. And the United States, specifically the United States, has been asking for such a plan. With every passing day, it'll seem like they're deliberately not making one.
You know, famously, the Marshall Plan that the U.S. instituted in Europe and Japan after the Second World War ended is a sort of model for how you rebuild an occupied country. But that involved an enormous amount of money and infrastructure and logistical support that it doesn't seem like anyone would even conceive of for this. But taking that aside, there's also, even when one plans for rebuilding a war-ravaged and occupied territory, there's a little bit of pipe dreaming around some of it. I remember speaking to U.S. authorities during the Iraq War about their plans after Baghdad was occupied, about how you would, quote unquote, bring Iraq back into the fold. And of course, a lot of it was ridiculous, bank branches for average Iraqi citizens, et cetera, et cetera. And none of that really ever got done in a way that was going to be viable on its own. And I think that that's both for the West Bank and for Gaza. Those are going to be really thorny questions that this occupation is going to throw into high relief. But it is stunning to me that the Israelis wouldn't have at least a blueprint for their own national security purposes, because they obviously border both of these areas, and it's in Israelis' interest to have stability in Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, I think your point is well. Sorry, go ahead, Marc.
No, I was just going to say, I think, in thinking about this, we need to remember that this particular Israeli government had a very, very clear, strong policy, which was to not engage with the Palestinian Authority, to not create any kind of path to a two-state solution. And, so that policy really broke down, and it just collapsed on October the 7th.
In fact, Marc, also playing Hamas and the Palestinian Authority off against one another.
Absolutely, and in the process, empowering Hamas. There were times where they even seemed to suggest, look, we can deal more easily with Hamas. They're fairly efficient, and they're behind their wall. The Palestinian Authority are shambles. They were completely obsessed with what was going on in the West Bank. But that policy has collapsed. But you have the same government in place. So how it is going to be very difficult for that government to put together, a day after policy that you could then sell to the Saudis, to UAE, to the Arabs, let alone the Arab street. Very, very difficult for them to do it.
I think the point you made, Tim, is very apropos, which is sort of the Iraq comparison. To bring this back to Biden, when he was in Israel, he made this point in the speech he gave there, which is that, to put it bluntly, don't make the mistakes we did after 9/11. We overreached. There was this moment of sympathy where the world was behind us. We had that energy, and as we were also fired up with a sense of vengeance and the sort of righteous sort of need to get back at those who had done this terrible thing. But then we overreached, we overstayed. We didn't have a plan. That's a crucial thing. We did not have a plan for what would happen afterward, and we started making things up as we went along, and it went horribly.
And there was a good argument, Bobby, for a surgical response to Al Qaeda and Bin Laden as a sort of eye for an eye response to the attack on the World Trade Center. But what happened was 9/11, the 9/11 response was magnified to ultimately include Iraq on very specious grounds, and then a long-term occupation of Afghanistan. And both of those things turned out to be massive, massive follies, both in terms of lives lost and money spent.
And I think, as you know, I was in Iraq for five years and change during the war, and it sort of, there was, I can hear the echoes, and there was this perception that, well, we'll go in there, we'll do what needs doing, and then the rebuilding, everybody will join us. The other Arab states will contribute, because after all, this is an Arab country, and surely the Saudis and the Qataris and the other Arab states will want to help us to rebuild. Well, no, not right away, not on our timeline. And I think that's something that we'll also see with Gaza when time comes, and we should wish that time comes quickly, to rebuild Gaza. The assumption that, the Qataris will deliver money, and the Turks will deliver construction companies, and everybody will pitch in.
Egypt will open its borders.
Egypt will open. We should not be so, and the Israelis certainly should not be so complacent. That there is a strong sense in the Arab world that we're not here to fix your mess. And it's hard not to recognize the sense in that. Which makes the planning for the day after even more important, even more essential.
Marc, given that we're not talking about how other actors in the region might look at this or respond to this, I'm curious about what would be the trigger for the Gaza conflict to move beyond that 25-mile length of land there or thereabouts, and become something that's even more perilous and regional, pulling Iran into the conflict more directly. They're suspected to have had a hand in this in some regard already, but to have a more overt and robust involvement. What will the Saudis do? What will Egypt do? And then if those sort of things start percolating, we've seen missiles launched from Syria, drone attacks and missiles from Syria and Yemen at both Israel and U.S. warships in the region yesterday. Those are sort of little inklings of how this kind of thing could get bigger and hotter more quickly. Tell me, Marc, how you think about that scenario, and if there's sort of a triggering kind of instance where it could broaden.
Yeah, actually, I've been thinking about it a lot. Obviously, another very important signal today is that the Israelis are evacuating a town near the Lebanese border. So they are now taking the possibility of a northern front seriously enough that they're moving civilians out of the way, which is the right thing to do. You do that before, not after, when it's too late. But nevertheless, it's a clear indication that they think this is possible. The thing is, I think you have to make a few distinctions.
Wait, can I stop you there for one sec, Marc, just on the actions at the Lebanese border, and just shoot me down if this is a stupid question, but I've wondered, because those began actually pretty early. There were strikes in Lebanon, I think within a day or two of the Hamas attacks, and so I read that as, so is this Hezbollah? Is this Iran? Is this Hamas camps in southern Lebanon? How did they get there, if it was, et cetera, et cetera? Can you clear that up a little bit for me?
I'm not sure I can, except that I don't think it was Hamas camps. I mean, Hezbollah's been fairly clear about what they're doing. Those were, symbolic strikes, if you like. In the same way as the U.S. has moved up carrier fleets, Hezbollah was sending, missiles across as a warning about, what you do in Gaza. So, really I think the way to look at it is, we don't know exactly what the planning is in Tehran or among Hezbollah. We can make some guesses. We can look at the situation of Hezbollah and say that objectively, it wouldn't look like a great time for them to get involved in a war with Israel, given just the situation, the politics in Lebanon. But beyond that, I think the way we have to think about it is just to say it's an incredibly volatile situation in which either Iran will see an opportunity, Hezbollah may feel that they are obliged to put their money where their mouth is, in terms of defending the Palestinian cause. And so the question then is, what will provide the trigger was your question. Things like the hospital disaster. It's I think looking back, obviously there was this sort of enormous back and forth over the initial attribution to Israel, the production of evidence that it wasn't Israel. But as far as the Arab Street is concerned, as far as Hezbollah's motivation to act, that probably doesn't matter a great deal. What will matter is the images that come out, the level of destruction, and what that provides in terms of legitimacy, opportunity, pressure for them to act. And it will be I don't know what the calculators will be. I don't have access to what the Iranians are, Revolutionary Guard are saying to the supreme leader. Those things will be decided at very high levels. But I think what we can say is that what happens in Gaza will have a big impact.
Bobby, Marc just mentioned the images of war and what a powerful factor they also are in this. We've talked a lot together so far about the tactile, tangible things, war and policy, and then some of the intangibles like bigotry and racism. Something that sort of strides both of those divides, the intangible and the tangible, is images, and then how they're propagandized or disseminated. And you've written very eloquently and with great insight about Hamas, because it's so murderous. I think 1,400 Israelis were killed in the initial strikes. About 200 are still held hostage. We can only hope they're safe, but given how grotesquely barbaric Hamas is, it's hard to have faith in that, but hope for all of them. The images that came out of this conflict in its early stages were bad for Hamas because the loss of innocent human lives was so visible. That's also a threat for the Israelis, isn't it? Once they occupy Gaza or become more pointed in their military response, the war of images is going to become a very important factor in all of this, won't it?
It is. In every war, sort of the war of images is a very important part, more so now than ever, because those images live for the rest of the world in our pockets constantly before our eyes. That aspect of warfare, propaganda images, become more and more important. And Israel had been on the losing side of that war for many, many years. All its previous incursions into Gaza, the bombing of Gaza after sort of previous attacks, smaller attacks by Hamas, all sort of had tended in the court of international opinion, public opinion, tended to make Israel look like the big bully and the Palestinians, and by inference Hamas as the sort of underdog. That changed on the 7th of October when Hamas basically came out of that sort of from behind the veil, if you like, and did this horrible thing. Not just that they attacked Israel, that they butchered women, children, elderly people, attacked a peaceful music conference, concert.
Festival.
Festival, and that they took these people back. This elderly woman being dragged back into Gaza, the body of a young woman being sort of mistreated on the back of a pickup truck. These images,
mistreated to say the least. Yes, apparently raped and murdered and brutally beaten.
I think so. Basically, this kind of for a lot of people who clung to this vision of Hamas as a legitimate resistance force. For a lot of those people, I think the wool came down from their eyes that day. And those images sort of underscored just how it's a word that's used around too often, but here I think it's appropriate. Barbarous, how barbarous the actions of this group are. And so the fact that this is a terrorist group more than it is a resistance group, I think came home to a lot of people around the world. Not everybody, but a lot of people. Now, the longer this conflict continues, and the more we see sort of images of Gaza being pulverized, and explosions in hospitals, and images of Arab children and women bathed in blood, then the sort of the narrative changes again, which again is something that you imagine that Israeli war planners as well as political leaders are thinking about. At least they ought to be thinking about that. The longer this goes on, the greater the risk that they will lose the sympathy that they had gained on the 7th of October. The world will move on from those images and be sort of attracted or captivated by the new images. Again, we saw that happen with the US after 9/11, enormous outpouring of sympathy, even from places where historically there had only been hostility. Iran, there were people holding candlelit vigils in Tehran, of all places. And then, when days turn to weeks to months to years, all that sympathy evaporated. And while here in the US, the memories of 9/11 never faded, in large parts of the rest of the world, they did.
Marc, do Israelis themselves distinguish between Hamas and Palestinians? That would be a useful way to think about, as Bobby talks about how potent and dangerous images of the savageries of war can be in terms of resolving or understanding a conflict. That can be tempered by human sympathy, which is often in short supply anyway during times like this. And one could argue that maybe it's not even necessarily early stages of retribution, but when you get past retribution and sympathy is a factor, how do Israelis view Gaza? There's 2 million people there. There's been this talk of, yes, well, they all should just relocate so the Israeli military can go in and do its hard and dirty work. But the reality is there's nowhere for those 2 million people to really go. No other countries want them. They're going to be in Gaza, I imagine, come hell or high water. So how are Israelis looking at this idea of a distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian people?
Yeah, it's an incredibly important question. I think the first thing I'd say is that almost everyone, to the point that Bobby was making before about the image war and the fear of losing that, that's very real. Almost everyone I've spoken to, before I can ask them a question, the first question they ask me is, how come the international media is being so biased towards Hamas and against us by assuming that this hospital attack was conducted by the Israeli Air Force, and then not even
which by the way, as the fact pattern developed, it wasn't conducted by the Israeli Air Force. We should note that.
Yes. So, and they're even now they're saying, there's huge sort of anger, both from the sort of spokespeople at the government against the BBC for, in their eyes, just, doing a sort of on the one hand, on the other, and treating Hamas and Israel as sort of equal parties to be equally believed or not believed. And then not sort of when there was evidence coming down and saying, clearly this was not Israel. So there's a lot of anger about that. And it's not just the government, as I say, everyone I speak to, that's the first question they ask before I can, open my mouth. So that's very live. On the question of, how they see the passage. So like every other nation on earth, Israelis are not one person. And they are, quite different in the way that they think about these things. It was very striking to me that there was, interviews with the brother of one of the people who was killed in the Hamas attack, where the brother said, the one thing I don't want to happen is for my brother's death to be used as a justification for killing Palestinians. So you have a pretty strong current, that is there, that says, there absolutely there is, Hamas and the Palestinians are not the same. And I was talking to someone who used to be involved in all the negotiations with the Palestinians yesterday, and he said 10 times in the course of our conversation, Hamas is not the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not Hamas. However, when you're just talking to ordinary folks, you do often get a but. Yeah, so they will say, they're not the same. Hamas is the enemy. The Palestinians are not the enemy. But there are a lot of Palestinians out there who do support Hamas, and that really angers us. And when they see the big protests, in the West Bank or elsewhere, even very early on, before the death toll in Gaza started to really mount, there were protests, against Israel and in favor of Hamas. So, that it is a very, very difficult question. But I think, I haven't met anybody who says, no, the Palestinians are, our enemy is the Palestinians. But it is, even some of the military leaders and politicians have failed to make the distinction publicly at times. And that, I think, is quite worrying.
Yeah, I think we need to hear that from Bibi Netanyahu in public. And I think he's missed an opportunity there. I'm reminded of after 9/11 how George Bush, immediately after visiting New York and goes to the mosque in Washington and says explicitly, Islam is not our enemy. And we can say, oh, that's just virtue signaling. But it was an important message at the moment that it was made. And it bought the U.S. a little more sympathy, a little more time, I think, in the eyes of the world. I think Bibi Netanyahu sort of never does this. And I think I think that's a mistake.
I would totally
On that
agree.
note
Yeah.
Go ahead, Marc. Sorry.
I was just going to just remind everybody that, even within Israel proper, there are about 1.5 million Arab Palestinians. So he has a large constituency there, which he ignores by not doing that.
On the note of hoping for rationality and clarity and communication in a world besieged by the opposites of all of those things, we'll have to tie this one up today, guys. Marc Champion, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist, joined us from Israel. Bobby Ghosh, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist, joined us here from the US. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm sure we'll be back with these gentlemen again to talk about the Gaza conflict. Thank you for joining us today.